Today on the program, is it possible for speculative fiction to express philosophical wisdom? This is a theme that we turn to again and again on conversations on Anarres. Can science fiction literature and film and other pop culture do more than simply illustrate already formed philosophical ideas? Can science fiction be more than just simply a pedagogical tool? Can it instead actually put forth new ideas of understanding the world, expanding our knowledge and our imagination of what is real and what is possible? My guest today thinks that science fiction can do this. Her work explores the ways in which speculative thinking has been key to philosophical exploration for centuries. Dr. Helen De Cruz is a professor of philosophy in the Danforth Chair of Humanities at St. Louis University. She specializes in philosophy of religion, experimental philosophy, and the philosophy of cognitive science. She's the co editor of the book Philosophy Through Science Fiction, and her latest book, which she edited and illustrated, is called Philosophy Illustrated 42 Thought Experiments to Broaden Your Mind, published by Oxford University Press. In it, she explores the ways in which philosophers use the tool of fictional stories known as thought experiments to create scenarios that allow us to test our intuitions about what is real, what is ethical, and what is humanly possible in a manner that mirrors the best of speculative literature. She also considers how visual art might be thought of as a kind of philosophical vocabulary. Paintings, for instance, she says, might be more than ways of illustrating what philosophers look like, but they in fact might be arguments themselves about who should be represented in philosophy and what are the kinds of subject matters that philosophy and philosophers ought to be thinking about. Let us turn now to our discussion with Dr. Helen De Cruz about Philosophy Illustrated. All right, we're back here now with Dr. Helen De Cruz. Dr. De Cruz, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Hi, nice to meet you, Joe.
I had the pleasure and the opportunity to talk with your co-editor last year, Eric Schwitzgebel, about the volume that you co-edited, Philosophy Through Science Fiction. And so I'm curious to now hear your take on some of this matters, because I know that speculative fiction broadly is something that you are interested in. You are both a philosopher and an author of speculative fiction. So, and your work is trying to investigate in some sense the intersections between these two. So before we get talking about philosophy though, I wanted to sort of get some sense about your background and your personal interest in science fiction or speculative fiction more broadly. Um, how did you become a fan of this form of literature?
I've I think I've always enjoyed speculative fiction before I even realized it was a special genre.
Mm.
Like when I was 7 or 8 years old and finally could read reasonably well. So we um, we were not an academic or literary household. Like the only books were basically cooking books and sort of practical child rearing guides and stuff like that in my parents' house. But there was a local library very close by, and the library had a nice selection of speculative fiction. So it had, when I grew up, this was like the 1980s. There was quite a large selection of speculative fiction for children. So you had, for example, Tonke Dracht, who is a Dutch author, and she has all sorts of stories like playing on Venus. So you have this story about people going to Venus, and it turns out the Venus is full of forests. So I love the idea. And then later you hear that Venus is not full of forests, which is a bit of a disappointment. And in fact, I just saw this as like a big continuum. Like you have literature, and in literature, anything can happen. Like that is the power of fantasy and science fiction. That literally anything can happen, but it does have to have its own internal logic. And I was very much attracted to that. And then, like many people, when you make the shift in middle school to grown-up fiction, and you think, oh my goodness, this is dull. Like, this is terrible. I don't like this. Although, I did come to appreciate lots of the, like, what we call the classics or the canon. But then I got to realize that there's actually also fun books for grown-ups, which is science fiction and fantasy for adults. And so I then only read Tolkien. So I read Tolkien, I think, only when I think it was 18 or 19. I had not read him. Like, I read all these people influenced by Tolkien, but I hadn't read him myself before. So I read him in university, as well as other speculative fiction like Heinlein and, sort of the classics. At the time, I was living in Belgium, and most of this was translated in Dutch. And it was just exhilarating. Like, it gave me back, a sort of a love for reading. And, well, as you become an academic, like, big broad strokes, then you think, academic stuff is supposed to be dull, right? But after a while, you start realizing that actually there is so much connection between philosophy and science fiction and fantasy, that a lot of the thought experiments that philosophers use, whether Parfit's teleporters, or Judith Jarvis Thompson's people seeds, they are basically speculative fiction. In fact, just the same but short. And there's lots of short fiction, as you know, that is like that. And so that is how gradually these two things came together, completely disconnected, came together, and I was really excited to do this volume with Eric. And I don't know if Eric, like, I saw parts of the interview, but I don't know if he told you anything about how we came to edit this volume, which is also, like, it sort of shows that there is an increased interest for science fiction and its intersection with philosophy, I think.
Yeah, I want to follow up quite extensively with that, and also the idea of thought experiments, which is part of your new work in your latest book. But I wanted to sort of think about, like, what were the influences in science fiction, speculative fiction, that really seeped into you. So you mentioned Tolkien and Robert Heinlein. Were there other authors that were particularly influential to you, that stick in your mind as folks whose work really sedimented in your imagination?
It must be in part the I see this word Anarres project behind your head. And so I have to think of Ursula Le Guin.
Mm.
And she is just such a giantess of science fiction and fantasy. Like, it's kind of hard to think of anybody who has done so much interesting philosophical work. I've read her in my 20s. I reread The Earthsea, except the last two books, to my son, because the last 2-3 books are just difficult for an 8-year-old, right? I think the sorts of things that she does, like the sorts of topics that science fiction authors now look at a lot, like, for example, gender. If you look at, say, Anne Leckie and her ancillary books, there is some exploration of what does gender mean when you have a gender blind person, in fact, and it's really interesting to see it through the lens of this person. But with Le Guin, you have these explorations, like in fantasy and science fiction, when there was hardly any attention for these things. Like, you have it a little bit in even like Heinlein and James Tiptree Jr. and people like that. But I think that if I had to pick, like, one author, then I think I should probably pick Le Guin because of the scope of the stuff that she does.
Well, we're obviously, big fans of her work here, and we've had some great conversations about her work, and we'll continue to do so. But I think you're right. She lends herself to her work lends herself to lots of really interesting and imaginative ways of thinking about philosophical wisdom and the kind of work that I think we do. Um, you've been talking about different forms of speculative fiction, and I know that your work is your own your own fiction writing is tends to be in science fiction. But I wanted to talk about other sort of genres about this to see if you think that there are important differences between the different kinds of speculative literature. Whether there's a difference between for you between some things like fantasy or alternative histories that people do, magical realism, particularly from Latin America. Do you think there's anything special or unique about the relationship of science fiction to philosophical thought and investigation? Or do you think that all these speculative forms do well in thinking about philosophical exploration?
So I think that you can do slightly different things with different genres, but I also think it's very hard to draw lines about like it seems to me that what distinguishes them is in many respects more than sort of the standard definitions like Brian Aldiss, I think, gives this definition that, but it might not be Brian Aldiss, so don't pay me. He says something like, with fantasy you have different laws of nature, and with science fiction you have the same laws of nature, but then you have weird things like you have ansibles and you have faster than light speed, and how do we deal with that? So I don't know if any sort of attempt to really make it a difference between these different genres is very difficult. But I think very often it's a difference in mood that I feel like, for example, magical realism. What makes magical realism its own genre is that it has a very specific feeling that I can't really put into words. But if you've read, like you will have read some of it too, and it has this very specific feeling that you don't have in science fiction or in fantasy. And it seems to me like, I can sort of think like, oh, I feel like fantasy now. I want to, and it's not so much that I want to sort of delve into a magical system or something like that, but more that I want to feel the scope of possibility of being in a completely different society with different rules, where the rules of nature do work differently, but there's also like the scope, particularly in things like epic fantasy, that you sort of think like here's a completely different world to go into. Whereas with science fiction, this can be the case, and that's why I think people like Le Guin and Jack Vance and other people like that, they really are at the sort of threshold between science fiction and fantasy, and that I particularly like that. I think that lends itself very well to sort of long thought experiments where you can think in detail about what's going to happen if we did this or that. The same with alternative history. So with alternative history, it's really like imagine if the US Civil War turned out differently, what would have happened, or if the Axis countries had won, but that's like constrained just like that. Whereas with epic fantasy, it blows open completely, like, and you can sort of think about many different topics that could be affected by the world that you're sketching, and that I find really interesting. So I think that you can do probably similar things across the genres, but the scope, the mood, you know, uh, the way you go about doing that is very different.
We've been talking mostly about literature. Are there other sort of popular culture versions of science fiction that you pay attention to? Do you movies, television shows? Is anything that you think is worthwhile or notable to pay attention to?
So it just so happens that I'm in the process of co-editing a volume on Avatar, The Last Airbender, and philosophy. So it's on the Nickelodeon series. It's not on the awful whitewashed movie that they made of it, but it's about the show. And I find it a very interesting show. I don't know if you have seen Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's a kids show, and I
Yeah.
only saw it in 2020 because one of my students said. So it basically came about like this. So one of my students who had grown up with the show.
Mhm.
So I taught philosophy of religion, and one of the things we looked at was Taoism. And he said, "I'd love to do my paper on the episode The Swamp." In Avatar: The Last Airbender, and the Taoist idea that everything is connected. So I said, sure, go ahead. I love it when students, come up with these ideas. So I thought, yeah, I need to watch this episode in order to understand what what the paper is about. And I thought it was really interesting and compelling. What sort of philosophical topics are in a
Mm,
kids show, like
mm.
things like genocide and things like imperialism and industrial, the badness of a sort of techno-industrial complex bent on conquest and stuff like that. And it does that because the nice thing with a TV show, and that's why there's so many fans of Star Trek, etc., is that you have this long format of exploring. You can focus on different things in the episodes, but you have overall themes like, the goodness of humanity that you can explore in the length of a show. In that respect, I think that a TV show is a lot like a novel or novel series, whereas a film is more like a short story because a film is really short, like an hour and a half or 2 hours, and that's it. So the number of things you can do with it is more limited.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that kind of coordination, right? We're thinking about literature and popular um, expressions like TV shows and movies. And like you, I've been impressed with some of my students with introducing me to different kinds of materials that I wouldn't have come across necessarily myself. The Last Airbender is one of those that people have been telling me for years, and I need to sit down and watch, and I haven't had a chance yet to. So that relationship to students and culture is something that I'm always really
Mhm.
interested in, as a way also to being able to explore a little bit more of some of these issues through forms that they're already quite integrated into their own lives. Um, well, let's talk a little bit specifically about science fiction. And this is a question that I posed to your co-editor Eric Schwitzgebel about philosophy through science fiction. It's sort of in the work that I've seen, the research I've seen about philosophy and science fiction. Um, there seems to be a couple of couple of arguments about the relationship of science fiction to philosophy. On the one hand, philosophy, some people say, is useful or good because it's a tool for helping to illustrate philosophical problems. So, in this sense, it's a kind of a mechanism that helps to teach philosophy. It helps illustrate problems. The second view, and I think that this is one that comes close to what Eric Schwitzgebel said in the program about a year ago. The other view is that science fiction stories actually are philosophy, that they advance philosophical positions or bring out philosophical wisdom in some sense. So, in your experience with working with philosophy and being a science fiction author and working in the intersection of these things, what do you think is the best way to think about the relationship of philosophy to science fiction stories in general?
Yeah, I love Eric's idea, which he defended as fake Eric in the intro. So, in the intro to Philosophy Through Science Fiction Stories, we had basically sort of fake versions, fictional versions of ourselves. So, fictional Helen, fictional Johan, fictional Eric. And fictional Eric indeed argued that, you can do philosophy through anything. Like you can have a hairstyle that expresses a philosophical idea. I love uh, the Eric idea, which I think is close to the true Eric as well, the fictional Eric idea that you can do philosophy through cocktails, through haircuts. Um, I do worry a little bit about, what is philosophy? Is in the end it becomes that any sort of thing that humans do that makes us reflect about ourselves, our place in the world, is philosophy. And there are several people who've argued that that's philosophy. Philosophy is just the sort of wonder that we have about um, the world around us. And I am very sympathetic to that position. Um, the one thing that I think you can't really think of is, okay, we can do. So I'm definitely on board with saying that they do more than just illustrate philosophical ideas, because that shows a kind of asymmetric dependence. And that dependence of, you have philosophical positions that people sort of think out, and then you can illustrate them with beautiful stories. But we know for a fact that that's not true, and that in fact, even the driest analytic philosophy has been inspired by fiction. And that's something interesting to think about. So I'll just give two examples. One of them is Bernard Williams's idea about, would you get bored if you lived forever? So this is a question, like, it's very hard, right? I mean, can you imagine, like, I'm thinking, like, I'm 43 years old, oh my god, where did the time go, right? So for us, because our lives are so short, it's very hard to think about what it would be like to live for centuries and centuries. But in fact, Bernard Williams argues that eventually you get so bored you wouldn't want to live anymore, and he uses this fictional case of Elena Macropoulos, I forgot now exactly her name, who lives like that forever, and she is full of despair and world weariness. So that's a fictional case that is actually used to as a starting point to get us thinking about a problem that we couldn't wrap our heads around otherwise. And the same with Derek Parfit. So Derek Parfit has numerous questions about personal identity, reasons and persons. And one of the things is, one of his thought experiments is the Russian nobleman. And that's also based on, is it unfinished opera or a story by Tolstoy or something? I forgot now. But basically, the Russian nobleman is this story. You have this young man who's very idealistic. He's super rich. And he says, look, I don't want to inherit these estates from my father. What I want to do rather is, when I inherit these estates, is give them to the peasant farmers who farm them. That should be the right thing to do, but maybe I'll become all bourgeois and change my mind when I grow older. So therefore, I'm going to make this document. It's legally binding. The only person who can void it is my wife. And unfortunately, as he gets older and his father gets older, he does become bourgeois, and he starts thinking, no, I want to, increase my estates and get some paintings painted about me, etc. And then the question is that Parfit asks is, should Anna, his wife, void the document? Or shouldn't she? Because he said, later, if I change my mind, don't do it. Just say, like, think about your ideals. And Parfit's strong intuition is she should not. I find it interesting that, again, this seems like a fiction case that is really sort of giving the fire in the story that makes the thought experiment go, that makes our thinking about these cases go, about personal identity. You have to think about cases where things actually happen.
Yeah,
So I think
it's the
that,
setting that sort of activates our intuitions that we want to explore.
that's right. So I think that you can do philosophy through fiction, but I'm not entirely sure if, like Eric, I would call any sort of fictional story philosophical. I don't know. Like, I'm not that liberal in my definition of philosophy. I do think that it's something that we don't do all the time. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like when you're suddenly thinking, oh, what am I going to do with my life, that you are engaged in philosophy. Not necessarily, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I like those two cases; those are very good. And the Macropolis case, right, is a classic one. We actually did an episode because there was a story in Star Trek Picard about this question that sort of tries to support the Macropolis case intuition, which I disagree with, by the way. I'm not sure that we would necessarily grow bored of living forever, so I'm not quite on board with that. But I think it is fascinating, and I think that this is one of those themes that gets picked up a lot in science fiction.
That's
The
right.
other thing it's interesting too, we've been talking about like how fiction inspires philosophical investigation, but I'm thinking about Ursula Le Guin, who said that her famous story, the ones who walk away from Omelas, was inspired by philosophy. Right, she was reading an essay by William James, and he poses the question, which is sort of central to the issue of the story of Omelas. And so she wanted to sort of embellish, in some sense, the kind of moral intuitions that James was investigating. So there can be both ways in this sense of this kind of this generative kind of relationship.
Hmm.
I wonder, as an author of science fiction yourself, how does that relationship work for your own fiction? Do you think about trying to portray philosophical ideas or express philosophical ideas, or have you thought of philosophy inspiring the fiction that you do?
It's interesting to like, I find the writing craft, and like you mentioned several times, I'm I write fiction, and I do, and I have several published stories I'm really proud of, but I'm also very new. So and like many kids, I wrote fiction, and then I didn't do it for the longest time. And then, there was the whole pandemic, and I thought, I want to do something for me. Something I've always wanted to do, not so much as in let's turn this horrible situation into something livable, but just, like, let's do something that I've always wanted to do, and that is pandemic proof. So that's how I restarted fiction, and really seriously. And it's interesting is that there is no sort of set recipe about where you get ideas. But so I naively thought, oh, it's so great that you might think, oh, let's see if utilitarianism is true. Let's write a story about that. But it doesn't work like that, unfortunately. You need a specific, in my view, what happens often is you get a specific thing that happens, or a specific idea that comes into your mind, and that becomes the beginning of a story. So, for example, with Omelas, in Le Guin's case, it is true that indeed she was inspired by philosophy, but also she was driving, and she saw in the rear mirror, she saw Salem, Salem, Oregon. It's in Oregon, isn't it? So, and then you turn around, it says Omelas, right? So she says, "Oh, I'm going away from Omelas. What's Omelas?" Right? And that's how the story starts, and it's very recognizable, because that's often how a story starts, just with an idea. Um, and it often ends up that the thing that you're thinking the story is about is not what the story is about. I think it's nice. You can just sort of, you know, write it, and philosophical themes will come up by themselves. This is very different from, imagine if you wrote a paper like that, be terrible. Like a paper, like, oh, it happens that I've written a defense of utilitarianism or something. Like, you can't write like that in for academia, or maybe you can. Maybe there's some people who write like that, but it seems to me that unless you're sort of like the really outlining person, that for fiction the philosophical ideas will reveal themselves in the interaction of characters and scene, and the initial idea and how that develops. At least for me, it's like that.
Yeah, thank you. That makes sense. That makes sense. Um, well, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of your more recent work. You've been giving some talks about, specifically about, as you mentioned before, the idea of awe and wonder in philosophy, and the importance of those moods for doing philosophical work. Right, going back, of course, to Aristotle. Right, in some sense, that sort of idea that the sense of awe and wonder is important for beginning philosophical reflection. But something that you've been lecturing about recently has been talking about how these moods find themselves in the work of early modern philosophical thinkers and science fiction writers, people who are like yourself on the intersection of some of these. Uh, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this more recent work that you're doing and what you consider to be the historical interrelationship between science fiction and early modern philosophy, specifically in terms of trying to express this notion or trying to elicit this kind of notion of awe or wonder.
Mm. So it from what so indeed, I'm working on a book, Wonderstruck, about wonder, and it's an awe. And I use this to I look at both emotions, because the traditional philosophical work has usually used words like taumazein and admiratio, and so in ancient Greece, the Middle Ages, and uh, words like, or Descartes' admiration, that express both awe and wonder. So there wasn't like this kind of fine-grained distinction that you start seeing in the later 18th century. And so there was an increased attention for, in early modern period, for emotions or passions or sentiments, and what they do for us. So it's not that people, of course, didn't think about emotions before. They did, and they had very refined ideas about it. But I think one of the innovations of, at least in Western philosophy, um, early modern thought, is to think more about how the passions move us. Like it's not so much the reality that moves us, but how we perceive reality. So there is a disconnect, and you see the disconnect, for example, in Shakespeare and other early theatre, where it's not that upon seeing that somebody's dead that you think, oh no, my lover is dead, I'm going to commit suicide, but because you think that your lover is dead, that you might be inclined, like, so there's this distance between reality and between perception. And that of course was a big early modern theme about how does reality and perception interrelate, and how and the passions in Descartes' work on the passions, La Passion de l'âme, is are these things are part of how we see the world. They help us shape the world. And this, of course, gives rise to skeptical worries. So Descartes' famous evil demon, like the evil demon can make you feel all sorts of things because you get these impressions, and you might be wrong about lots of things. The world might be very different. So in part, so this is a sort of continued uh, continued idea in Descartes. Uh, One of the things you can do is try to train your passions, a bit like a hunting dog. So you can train the hunting dog to not startle, but in fact go in the direction you shot. And similarly, you can train your passions. So he thought wonder is the first passion. It's actually before everything else, before you start evaluating. So you have, for example, fear. Fear is always negative, and joy is always positive, but wonder is neutral because it is the first passion. It's the first passion that when you encounter something that is new to you, or when you encounter something as if that's then later people like Sarah Ahmed, they see it that way, um, as if you see it for the first time. And so the nice thing with science fiction is that indeed you could let people experience things that are new and wondrous. Like, so you had all sorts of work about let's go to the moon. So you had Kepler's Somnium, which is a short story about somebody who dreams, and then, sort of several layers. It's not particularly well written, but then, we're around the early 1600s. And then you have basically people who hear about what life on the moon would be like. And you have Cyrano de Bergerac's Voyage to the Moon. So there is this sort of sense of the wondrous, the unexplored. You have, of course, travelogues, travel diaries of people who went to distant lands like the Americas, and they would talk about how things are different. And so the fact that you emotionally respond to this difference, to this foreignness, to this weirdness, um, is something that helps people to see things in a different way. And you can see it particularly in, say, Swift. So Gulliver's Travels is written like such a travel diary, but of course, it's fictional. It's about this captain, the sea captain, who goes to all these different countries, and so he uses the fact that you go to a country where everybody's very small, everybody's very large, everybody's very old, people are horses and they think that humans are savages. What happens there is because of the inversions, because of the unfamiliarization, that you can see your own society with new eyes. And I think that's actually a continued theme of science fiction that we still have today. So that's why I think, where do you put science fiction? I think that the early modern works, even though they're not called science fiction, I think there's a good case to be made to call them science fiction, in spite of the fact that they weren't called that.
Yeah, no, this is very fascinating. I'm thinking, of course, of something like Moore's Utopia, right? In
Hmm.
1517, right? I think it's come in utopian literature research. I mean, I think it's pretty well set, the idea that part of what this work did was, as you were explaining, is that the inversions of utopia allowed people, readers, to be able to criticize, to reflect more deeply on the flaws of their own society at the time, through this kind of fictional travel log, and that this was a growing kind of awareness in Europe at the time because of the the arrivals in the Americas and so forth. And so I think that there's something to this, that there's some important kind of core work between utopian science fiction, speculative literature, and philosophy in this period, right? The sort of birth of early modern thought. Would you say that the is Descartes' Demon speculative fiction? Does it fall within
Hmm.
that kind of genre?
Yeah, probably not though, because I mean, it's sort of like imagine God. No, imagine a demon. So it's really a thought experiment. Although I think that it's blurry. It's blurry, and surely that sort of fiction could be unsettling. It could get you thinking about about things you took for granted, basically.
Right, right, right. Well, you mentioned thought experiments, so I wanted to talk to you about this. Your most recent book is called Philosophy Illustrated by Oxford University Press. And what you've done in this is you represent a variety of classical philosophical thought experiments, some of the ones you've already mentioned already, and you pair them with illustrations done by yourself. So not only are you a philosopher, right? You're also a science fiction author, and you're also an artist. So I wanted to ask first, what motivated you to put together a collection like this, in which you have some of the classic philosophical thought experiments with uh, artistic representations of them?
I think actually that drawing thought experiments is something that many of us do spontaneously. Like, you know, draw a stick figure on the blackboard and say, like, here you have a prince, for example, for Locke's cobbler and prince, and here you have a cobbler, and the mind of the prince goes into the body of the cobbler. Unfortunately, the mind of the cobbler doesn't go into the body of the prince because that was Locke. After all, he was such a classist person. Um, so what happens? Like, is this the same person? Why not? And you draw it like so. So I think that many people do this, or if you use PowerPoint, that you will try to find a picture that would fit. And it's not just like maybe it's because just PowerPoints with no pictures are boring, maybe, but it's also because we feel that our students are really helped with visual aids sometimes. Now, different people have different learning styles, but some people like to visualize things. And it's interesting, there's a whole range. So you have all the way from people with aphantasia. And it's interesting, I talked a bit with people who have aphantasia and they have this book. They find it very interesting because they see nothing, these thought experiments. So it's an interesting to see a picture of how you could imagine it, because they do not imagine. And then you have, on the other hand, people who sort of see, even for abstract things, they see some visual representation. So I think, in a sense, it is useful to think about how a picture can illustrate certain ideas or bring out certain features of a thought experiment that you can't easily convey. So I try to do that in the pictures. Like I try to think about how uh, how could we think about these thought experiments in a way that the picture sheds some light or gives some visual commentary on the thought experiment. There's also, yeah.
Well, so I have a question about that too. Is Do you think that I mean, so thought experiments, like you've mentioned before the Macropolis case, these kind of fictional examples, they're meant to sort of capture a moment in which we then bring our philosophical intuitions to. I'm wondering whether part of what I hear you saying is that you think that perhaps representations in art can heighten or highlight some of these intuitions more strongly. I'm wondering, like, what exactly is the role that these illustrations have for helping to deepen our philosophical awareness? So is there a kind of wisdom that comes by thinking about these thought experiments through illustrations rather than just through reading them strictly on a page?
I think there is, for the following reason. So, actually, doing philosophy through pictures is something that we have kind of lost. In that it is something that was really widespread. Like in Europe, you had a semi-literate population and largely illiterate population. But one of the ways in which church paintings, for example, could convey fairly complex ideas like the Trinity. So this is theology rather than philosophy, but the Trinity, the sorts of things about the obedience of Mary when she says yes to the angel and things like that, is to depict it visually. So that's what they did. And they had these really complex. So if you look at, say, 15th century Flemish paintings, then you'll have like often 4 or 5 different ideas or scenes within one painting, and super sophisticated. And there's some things that even now, as art historians, we have to piece together, because it's not that there's handbooks about, and this is how you have to read. If there's a broken tile floor, it means this or that. We have to, learn about how this is done. But this was actually, you know, pretty. This was part of people's thinking language. This was part of their way of thinking about difficult concepts. And the same in a lot of Asian paintings. Like if you have Chinese art with flowers, the flowers mean something. Like the picture of, say, a very late winter or early spring plum blossoms are not just plum blossoms. They show the resilience of the scholar who's trying to study for the exam, stuff like that. So there is this very detailed and rich pictorial way of thinking, of where certain images can sort of elicit certain thoughts. And if you are somebody who has a visual memory, then you might, you can think about those images. Or if you have no visual memory, then looking at those images brings in you certain ideas and associations and can help you think along. Um, so I think in that respect, and I hope that this has succeeded with the book, I'm trying to revive some of this thinking, that I think is now a bit sort of atrophied and impoverished, but that has been a rich tradition, thinking philosophically through imagery.
Well, I have a couple of questions that I want to ask you about that, but let me ask this question: was in because what you do is you it's sort of a catalog of different thought experiments with illustrations. Were there any of them that you found that you enjoyed doing more so than others, or that conversely that you had difficulty trying to figure out how to depict?
Take John Rawls's uh, veil of ignorance and original position thought experiment, where you have a bunch of people and they're wondering about what the ideal society looks like, and they're going to design it not knowing the position in which they will be when they come in that society. They won't even know, they won't know their gender, their ability, their social class, not even if they are naturally talented or not. So the idea being that you would try to minimize the luck, the bad influence of luck. Like imagine if it's a purely meritocratic society, but unfortunately you do not have many natural gifts, then you would be in a bad situation. So that's the thought experiment. So how do you draw people in the original position? The very first draft I did, I made some sort of stick figures who were thinking about, and you had this veil. But then I thought, should people who deliberate like that really be like almost non-persons, or could they be persons that already are embodied, etc., but they don't know what they'll be like in that world? And so I drew it like that. So you have a wheelchair user, so you have people of various ages, abilities, etc., thinking about what their what the society should look like. And so on the up behind the veil, I drew then different people with different positionings, um, and that worked a lot better. And I sort of thought that also makes it interesting for us to think that we could be sort of impartialist about what the world would look like. Like it doesn't, we can do that even as we are embodied beings. So I like doing it that way, and that worked a lot better than the first draft for this drawing. On the other hand, I honestly tried to draw the trolley problem. It just didn't work. And after draft 4, I gave up. I don't know, like, I think that one of the things is that I just don't like the thought experiment. And that's always a problem. Like, if I like it, it works better, but I just don't think the thought experiment really works that well. And so, like, I don't know. I gave up. The best try I did was somebody who was so. It's not in the book. It's quite funny. It's not in the book. It's one of the most famous thought experiments. But I ultimately didn't feel like I could add anything to the thought experiment, and I don't like the way that you can see. Like, you can Google and you can see hundreds of trolley problems, and I don't think they work any more than mine did. So anyway, that's if it really didn't work, then I didn't include it. Then there was the cave. I thought, okay, I have to do the cave, right? The cave has to be in. But unfortunately, it didn't work. So again, I had this sort of diagrammy sort of thing, and it just, I thought, this is not working. Although, it's perfectly fine. There's many illustrations like that, but I didn't feel like I was giving a visual commentary. It's more like, oh yeah, imagine. And if Plato didn't describe it well, here's a picture to show you how it's done. But then I was reading a young adult, a novel for young adults. It's called The City of Amber. I don't know if you know it. It's about this story where you have, teenagers who are in a city that is basically under the ground, and there's only artificial light, and the lights are going out, and they have to find a way out of the cave, right? And I thought, yeah, actually, the cave is totally a young adult novel, right? It's totally so. I then thought I have to draw this like a comic, a long adult comic, and I'll use sort of red pottery, red style pottery of that you have in Greek vases for the aesthetic, but the feeling of it is the feeling of getting an education, and the exhilaration that you get from getting this knowledge, and that's what I wanted to convey in the drawing.
Well, it's interesting because the way that you're speaking of this is that you were doing more than just simply trying to illustrate the thought experiments. You were really trying to, in some sense, capture the wisdom, if anything, of that moment in a kind of way. And so, as you're right, there's tons of trolley problem illustrations you can find on the internet, and also Plato's cave. But what you were really trying to do was something different than illustrating the written word. You were trying to capture a real moment of philosophical intuition and wisdom.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Well, hopefully you can see
Hopefully.
it when it arrives.
Very good, very good. Well, so this raised another question for me in your mind. You were saying that in some sense, there's a tradition of thinking about art as expressing ideas that only can be expressed through art. I'm wondering whether you would say the same thing, that perhaps there are certain ideas that only can be expressed or expressed well through science fiction or speculative literature. Would you say that that's possible?
I think so. Yeah, I think because of what it does, it is unique in creating a world that is not this world, but very recognizable, but at the same time evoking wonder because it's different enough. And so I think there are certain things, like you can do lots of things with just literary fiction, and I don't like the fact that if it's realistic, then it's literary. But that's how the in literary fiction you can explore loads and loads of different ideas, but there's certain sort of speculations that I think speculative fiction lends itself uniquely well to. Like, just looking at the very basis of our world, particularly the social basis. So you could say, oh, the nice thing about science fiction is different gravity and, stuff like that, and different seasons, like in Heliconia by Aldous, where you have like very long warm periods and very long cold periods. But what is really interesting about that is not so much that there's long and cold periods, but how people socially react to it. The same with N.K. Jemison's sort of really tectonically unstable world, where you have people who can influence these tectonic activities. What is interesting is not so much the magic system, although the magic system is really cool, and you need the magic system there. I mean, she does also call it a magic system, although it's debatable. I mean, you can, what you would call it, that the orogeny, the ability of some people to use to influence tectonic activity. But what is the interesting payoff that you get from that is that then through that you can think about how would this influence society, like what people would want to control those people with those magical abilities, of course, because otherwise so that is the payoff that you get, the sort of thinking about how would it change society and what can that tell us about our society.
Yeah, I think that that's definitely right. Um, well, you mentioned that you're working now on a book about on wonder for philosophy. I was wondering, where do you see your work heading now? Do you have other projects in the works that deal with these kinds of questions about the intersection of philosophy and science fiction?
The other major thing that I'm working on next to this edited volume on Avatar: The Last Airbender, which is almost going to be submitted, is an edited volume together with Eric Schwitzgebel and Rich Horton. And this is a book that's going to look again at philosophy and science fiction, but there is a crucial difference with the book that we have just published last year. And the difference is that we want to look at classic works, so works that weren't specifically commissioned, but that have already existed, like Omelas. And we look at how, what is philosophically interesting about them. So we put them together, and the hope is that people can read this just as an interesting selection of stories. But next to that, they could use this for teaching purposes, and they could also just think about the different philosophical themes that we will bring together.
I wonder something. Have you ever uh, there was a work that came out of speculative fiction a few years ago, Octavia's Brood, by a colleague, Walida Imarisha. And what she was trying to work on was this idea of visionary fiction in the sort of tradition of social justice science fiction. And so she commissioned a volume of speculative fiction stories, but she didn't ask authors to do it. She asked social justice organizers and activists to write science fiction.
Mm,
And many of them were like, well, I'm not a writer. And she said, but you are, in the sense that you work in a world of science fiction. You're trying to imagine a world that does not exist through the kind of activism that you do. How would you tell a story about the kind of world that you want to build? And so, in the ways that you've been talking about it, that how science fiction allows us to imagine worlds that are inverted from the ones that we actually exist in. Uh, Adrian Murray Brown and Walida Marisha believe that organizing, social justice organizing, is a kind of thinking in that manner. I wonder
mhm.
if you've ever thought of asking philosophers to write science fiction stories.
Yeah, so I have planned this summer a workshop where we can, it's going to be in person. so,
Okay.
Anne Leckie, Rachel Neumeier, and Sharon Shin and Rich Horton are going to teach philosophers how to write science fiction. So it's specifically meant for people who would like to do this, but who have no experience doing it. Actually, it's just fiction writing, although we do say in the call very clearly, and the call is still open until the 1st of March, by the way, and it's going to happen this summer. Um, so fiction writing is something that many philosophers would like to do. At least I've heard informally that they say, "Oh, it's nice. I would love to do this," but it's also very difficult. It's a craft. The problem is a bit if you're going to come into it cold, it's extremely difficult. And we can see this with other things, like say playing the guitar or drawing. It is a craft that requires learning the procedures and rules so that you can express your ideas more efficiently. Um, because academics write a lot, but writing fiction is just difficult. I find it, like, I don't know, it doesn't come naturally to me. I've really had to learn, to workshop it, to get feedback from more experienced authors. I have read several guides. It's hard. Like, you have certain ideas, but it's hard if you don't know how to do it, to actually express those in story formats. I don't know if you have you experimented have you experimented with fiction yet? Then you will
No,
find.
this is one of the talents that I do not have, which is writing fiction. But I agree with you, and I can see how that might be. And
Mhm.
we can definitely link to your workshops and the rest of your work as well on our website for readers and
Right.
viewers to take a look at. So appreciate that. But that sounds fascinating. I'm looking forward to the new projects coming out.
Thank you.
Well, th- Dr. De Cruz, I really appreciate you coming on the program to talk with us about this. I look forward to Philosophy Illustrated. It's in the mail. I'm waiting for it. I've enjoyed thoroughly philosophy through science fiction. And I appreciate your time coming to help us understand this relationship a little bit more.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. And thank you for coming and spending some time with us to listen in and to think about philosophy and science fiction. If you would like to hear more, you can listen to some of our other interviews on our YouTube channel. And you can find the Anarres Project at anarresproject.org. You can find us on all the socials too, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and you can listen to our audio program on Anchor FM. Thanks very much for listening.